All right, so the claim I'm going to be refuting today is the claim that technology and social media negatively affect the way that we live our daily lives. And my opponent's main three claims were that technology negatively impacts the way we communicate with each other, that social media affects the way we present ourselves, and we rely too much on media and the internet. My main focus is going to be on points 1 and 2, since I'm willing to concede the third point. So, for the first point, she begins by mentioning that the convenience of technology has made us lazy, and then goes to cite a quote from this website by a guy by the name of Ajay Kumar about how before the evolution of technology, humans were more focused on goals, more productive, more creative. And the main problem I found with that site was that I looked at it a little bit more, and that not only was that original source, it itself had no sources. This entire site was being run by one man, and it seemed to be more of a blog than actually an authoritative source on this information. And furthermore, this is a claim being made about history by a man who has IT knowledge. Not to discredit IT, but that's not a history field, so it's not entirely the most accurate data to be using as a support for this basis. And on top of that, that's actually something that's referred to as a cognitive bias, or to be specific, it's a rosy retrospection, which is a form of cognitive bias where essentially your brain is more, leans towards looking at the past as a better thing than the present. And so while that isn't technically a fallacy, it's kind of riding that line right on being one, where it's not entirely an accurate thing to be using as a piece of evidence. So in addition to that, the second little sub-point used for this first point, that technology negatively impacts the way we communicate with each other, is that technology distracts us from social interaction. And part of my contention with this is that it talks about how people will be focusing more on their phones or on their technology than face-to-face interaction. And I'm willing to concede that people may be doing that, but I think that considering the ability for technology to allow people to communicate with each other instantly with millions of different people around the world, either on social media or direct text-to-text messaging or FaceTiming, I think I'm willing to make a counterclaim there that technology has changed the way we've communicated with each other, but I don't know if you can blame technology for distracting us from communicating with each other. If anything, I'd be willing to say that someone who's looking at their phone while you're talking to them, it isn't the technology's fault, it's that they don't have good manners. And so I don't know if you should be blaming technology on that for the issue there. And so, yeah, I'd like to just sort of close that. It's the tech equivalent of the guns kill people argument, which is to say, sort of, but that's a little bit more complex than just saying that. So moving on to my second critique of her argument, which was her point of the media affects the way we present ourselves. So the first point she made there was that we put on a front for the world for the rest of the world to see. And it uses a quote from a Weight Matters campaign website about how the media can project an image that's unrealistic for us and how we present ourselves. But the problem with that is that, I mean, it's technically a blog post, if that's not even my issue with that. The problem with that is that it's focusing on weight and particular body image. Her whole point there is that we put on a persona, essentially. I believe that was the word that she used in her speech. That's not exactly the most relevant data to be using. Again, it's not entirely backing up her statement there. It's like you can find a weak correlation, but it's potentially distracting by getting off into another tangent, which isn't actually focusing on the issue at hand, which is about how media will affect the way that we present ourselves. And so moving on to her next little point here, or I guess more continuing on my first critique there, is that the media's role in that type of behavior in persona, in the way that we project personas, is in no way shown to be a causal link. There's the fact that we present personas is, that's certainly undeniable. I'm presenting a persona to give this speech right now, but that doesn't mean that there's some sort of third party imposing this on me. This is something that people do in their normal lives. And so that's sort of connecting into her second point for this, that the media pressures us to act in a certain way. And this is backed up by a quote from Psych Central, from Kelsey Sustrom, where she says something like, we are conditioned to project only our best, albeit unrealistic selves in social media profiles as a modern way of virtually keeping up with the Joneses. I hope you're familiar with that sort of phrase. The problem with that is that while this is a certainly valid source, when I actually looked more into this article, it sort of became questionable whether I should be using that interpretation of that source as the only way to look at that. In fact, later on, there was actually a quote that was discussing how like the phenomenon of people using personas is more in line with Carl Rogers' concept of the ideal self. That we have a general persona that we construct and we put this out to show how we want to be seen by people. Well, the issue with that is that if we're looking at this source, I could be interpreting that the exact other way and actually arguing against her with that own source, rather than just following what she's trying to claim here. So again, the counterclaim I want to make is that you can interpret the media as not really being responsible there. So to conclude, yeah, technology has changed, and we're like I'd say it's more changed and negatively impacted. It's not necessarily the technology or the media's fault that we behave in certain ways, and they just happen to be a platform for that. And that, in general, there may be some problems with the way that we communicate, but it's more complex than just blaming it on technology. So, thank you.
Well, most of your arguments are presses on the first 2 points. They are interesting questions that you pose, ideas that suggest that maybe there are unreasonable conclusions being drawn from some of the examples, and I think you raise a couple of interesting points. Almost all of it, I think, could have been done almost immediately after the speech. There's not much depth in terms of research here that demonstrates any counter evidence or conclusions, so I think that's a little bit problematic. The choices that you made, though, I thought were pretty good ones concerning what the responses were. The idea that that the source is, on the first point, that it's not necessarily a valid source, that it doesn't really look at history in a very effective way because the person that we're talking about isn't an expert on that particular site, and then you've got this kind of bias idea built into it, which I think is a reasonable press, but there's even less evidence for that than there was for what the advocate was saying on that particular situation. That's your assertion entirely. The idea of social interactions, and you suggest that that there are lots of opportunities that exist because of social media. I think that's okay. The idea that people are being rude and that simply it's an issue of manners, I think that's an interesting point. You're suggesting that the source of the problem here is not the technology itself, but the lack of training that people have. Okay, that seems pretty reasonable to me. That's a good press, again, but it's just a press. On the self-presentation issue, I think you do state an obvious point. We all are engaged in this self-presentation, and there's nothing that's particularly unique about this. You do have a good press here suggesting that body image is not necessarily the same thing as persona, although I think there is potentially a connection between those two things. You acknowledge that there might be a correlation, but you don't tell us why that difference is particularly substantial or important. And we're back to the same issue. If persona is the same as body image, how is the social media distorting it? I'm not exactly sure that you discuss the advocate's evidence with much clarity there. We're back to the situation about, it's not the media's role, it's somebody else's issue that's going on here. You had an example earlier that I thought was also kind of interesting, that right at the end of that first point where you were drawing a comparison to guns, and it's like the guns don't kill argument, I think, is what you were trying to talk about there. I think you needed to explain that a little bit more, and I think we got the same thing going on here. I think we need a little bit more explanation that's going on to be provided. You concede the third point, suggesting that it's not really relevant to the main proposition, I suppose. I think you ought to explain why it's unimportant. All right, thank you.